This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brem. Today we unpack the Chinese term Minjian and conceptualize it for the field of comparative education. My guest is Baiwen Peng.
So in general, I would argue across different contexts, legitimate Minjian is a space for non-state education that in different ways sort of partner with the official dome. Was it partner with the government? So, such education could take place in private schools, in different countries, different societies, in private schools, in universities, as well as in forums, like private tutoring, in different contexts.
Baiwen Peng is a doctoral student in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. His new article is entitled Minjian, Exploring Education Among the People in China, which was published in Comparative Education. Baiwen Peng, welcome to FreshEd.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start by trying to define this term that you wrote the whole article about called Minjian. How are different people, or how have different people and different scholars defined this term in both the English language literature as well as the Mandarin literature?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So first of all, I want to say that Minjian, of course, I'm using it as an academic term, but Minjian has been used a lot in everyday conversations in China for a long period of time, right? So Minjian, its literal meaning is among the people, because Min, M-I-N, means people, and Jian means a space, or something like that. So Minjian basically means among the people, and it has the connotation of being beyond official tongue. Was it being not being unofficial, or is it being a non-state? So this is what Minjian means in everyday conversations in China. So different researchers, different scholars, they have tried to theorize Minjian for research purposes. And so to the best of my knowledge, the first scholar who did this is Sihe Chen, who is a professor not in education, but in literature studies. So by literature here, I mean novels, poems, that kind of thing. So he developed Minjian as a theoretical resource in the 1990s. Actually, he published several articles just talking about this concept. So for him, Minjian is a literary genre, focused on the everyday life of ordinary people, rather than the state narratives or say the state's political projects. And that genre was developed in the 1960s and 1970s when the Chinese state was very actively engaged in nation-building projects promoting, for example, socialism, right? So Minjian and the mainstream literature production in the 1960s and 1970s had to serve the purpose, have to help the state do that nation-building kind of a project. But Minjian literature was very different, because Minjian literature was really talking about the everyday life experiences of ordinary people. So that is the origin of Minjian as an academic resource. But then the next key scholar that theorized Minjian is actually he's a Taiwanese scholar. So his name is Guangxi Chen, and he published a book called Asia as Method. So that book came out in 2010. So it's like almost 20 years after, the first scholar who worked on the literature studies published his articles on Minjian. So there's a 2-decade gap in between the two authors. So Guangxi Chen, in his book Asia's Method, developed this idea of Minjian society. So actually, the Minjian society is developed from something called political society from the subaltern studies. So what he meant by Minjian society is that Minjian society is in between the civil society and the government, because according to Guangxi Chen, both the civil society and the state represent the interests of privileged social groups, and the truly disadvantaged populations, they form a coalition called Minjian society. So this is how, Guangxi Chen, understood Minjian society. But, as you can tell, it's a very political concept. Actually, Minjian society is directly from political science. So it's very political. And then, the next key scholar is Sebastian Weck. He's French. And in 2019, he published a book titled Minjian, The Rise of Grassroots Intellectuals in China. So as you can see, he understands Minjian as grassroots. So in that book, I was really inspired by this book. And that book was really shaped in how I think about Minjian. So in that book, the author used the word officialdom. So that's why I am using the word officialdom to talk about my understanding of Minjian. So according to him, Minjian means outside the borders of officialdom. And the author identified 3 characteristics of Minjian, including first, independence from state income. Second, lack of approval by the state system. And third, a low social marker, or say non-state or grassroots. So this is how he understands Minjian. But as you can tell, the first 3 authors, their understanding of Minjian are more or less political in one way or another to different extent. But another scholar, a key scholar who theorized Minjian, actually, so this book is more recent. It was published in 2021. And that book is in Chinese. So that book talks about the concept of Minjian parenting. So what is Minjian parenting basically refers to a kind of locally grounded beliefs and practices surrounding what good parenting means. So you can compare Minjian parenting to something like folk pedagogy from the Western kind of literature. So Minjian parenting is really rooted in what, for example, a certain village culture considers appropriate for parents to do, that kind of thing. So, and of course, the latest publication on Minjian is by a professor in arts history, not education, arts history. And her name is Chang Tan, and that book came out in 2024. So basically that book talks about how a group of the so-called Minjian artists, they tried to stay away from the arts kind of mainstream. They tried to stay away from the arts establishment, and they migrated to a small village somewhere in China. And their work drew heavily on the local culture, just in that village, in resistance against the arts establishment and the arts mainstream. So as you can tell from this case, both culture and politics are visible there. Politics in the sense that there is a sense of resistance against the mainstream. But it's also about culture because these artists drew on the local culture to produce their artwork.
How then do you begin to understand it? So there's these 2 major different sort of camps. There's the side that emphasizes the political nature of Minjian, and then there's another group that sort of emphasizes the cultural group, the folk history, the folk culture of the idea of Minjian. How do you then see it? How do you want to start defining this term?
Actually, I was really struggling, with defining Minjian because I think it seems all of these kind of approaches make sense, right? When we think about Minjian, it's like, yeah, it's culture, but it's also about politics. All of them make sense. So how to navigate this kind of a multi-layered kind of nature of Minjian, how to navigate the complexity of Minjian. So I also wrote this in my article. I wrote, actually, all of these conceptualizations make sense because all of them align with the fundamental meaning of Minjian, which is among the people. So I was thinking about how to define Minjian given such complexity. So I think Minjian, just based on all of these different conceptualizations, I understood Minjian is something that is very much adaptable, flexible, inclusive, and fluid. And then just thinking about these qualities of Minjian, just all of a sudden I came to this analogy of water. It's like when I thought about water, I was thinking about, water is shapeless. It's, it adapts to different circumstances and it can fit into whatever container, right? So I was like, it's like water is a great analogy for me to define Minjian because Minjian itself is very adaptable. It's very, I would say it's messy, to some extent because it can be this, it can be that, but how to define it in a very clear way. So I also wrote this in my article. So to develop a sort of holistic conceptualization of Minjian, I argue that the Minjian, this term is better understood as fluid with a scope of meanings, and it shifts within its own boundaries and manifests itself in ways that fit into specific circumstances. So this is a sentence I wrote in my article. So basically, this is really like water.
And that's a great analogy to begin to try and make sense of this fluid term that can take on socio-political and cultural understandings of space itself and how people's ideas and values and sort of resistance against officialdom might take shape. And then you go further and you begin to try and break down Minjian a little bit more. And you come up with these 2 broad categories of Minjian. Minjian. One is what you call legitimate Minjian, and then another one is called shadowy Minjian. What's legitimate? How would you begin to define what legitimate Minjian is?
Yeah, so this is another great question. I developed a diagram included in the article. So actually, it's going to be easier for me to refer to that diagram for me to explain, to visually talk about what legitimate and shadowy Minjian is. But I can just talk about that here. But so basically, the diagram includes nested circles, and then I place the state, the Chinese state, as the center of the nested circles. So the Chinese state takes the central position because it is very powerful. So it influences all aspects and all dimensions of the Chinese society. So the Chinese state is a circle positioned at the center of the nested circles. So I hope you can just depict a diagram in your mind as what that looks like. And then, so that's the state. But of course, there is a state and there are areas that are outside of the state, right? So I call areas that are really, really close to the state legitimate Minjian, and areas that are far from the state, or say that the areas that are distant from the state, shadowy Minjian. So this is basically what the diagram looks like. So now I'm talking about what legitimate Minjian is. So a legitimate Minjian is very close to the state. And because of this proximity, legitimate Minjian, all the activities, or say visions, or say values even, inside legitimate Minjian are highly aligned with the state ideology and agenda and values. And precisely because of this alignment, legitimate Minjian has the legitimacy to be publicly seen, right? So I hope this makes sense. And as we move further away from the state into shadowy Minjian, these areas have activities, values, or ideologies that are not necessarily the same as the state's ideology and values. So there's a difference, right, between shadowy Minjian and the state. And precisely because of this difference, shadowy Minjian receives increasingly less legitimacy to be seen, and increasingly more and more kind of a shadowy. So this is how I understand this.
Is there a geography to this where the further one gets away from, say, the center of state power, Beijing, the more shadowy Minjian you could find?
Yeah, I think geography is definitely a factor in this, but it's not required. It's not necessary, because I think maybe it's not research, but I think there are some news stories about a group of people who just migrated from Beijing, the capital city of China, from Beijing to a kind of a neighboring province of Beijing. So it's not very far. So geographically, maybe just 100 miles away from Beijing. So it's not very far. But what these people were doing was that they set up a kind of autonomous community. It's like a self-governing autonomous community kind of thing. So I think, but that community geographically is not very far from the capital city of Beijing. But I would really consider that community as a Minjian community, as a community that was developed just from the people, among the people. So that community was more kind of a bottom-up instead of top-down. So, but I think you asked a very good question. So geography makes sense and may be important, but it's not necessary. But as I will talk about this later, so I will talk about the innovative schools, but these schools are really very far away from the Beijing, which is the political center of China. But I will talk about that later.
What I love, in many ways, I see parallels to how you're theorizing this to James Scott and his work. He has this idea called shatter zone, and it's sort of this zone. He actually is very focused on geography. But as you get further away from state power, you see very different cultures, values, norms, and ways of living as you get further away. And I think the metaphor that he uses is a candle, and the idea of it's really bright at the center of the candle, but as the light dissipates outwards in a dark room, it sort of becomes more shadowy, to use your word. But of course, for him, distance and geography is sort of a key factor in where you might see, alternative ways of living compared to the mainstream state-sanctioned ideas. You have a slightly different take here, but I can see parallels, and I really love it. I think it can be really generative. So maybe now we should turn to education and start unpacking some of the main topics in education that scholars have looked at in China of late. And one of the big ones that we have read about, I remember reading about it in many different English language articles, is this term called Minban education, which I guess kind of often is just translated as like private education. But maybe tell us what Minban education is and how it might connect to your conception of Minjian.
Yes, it's a great question because a lot of my friends, so in the early stage of me writing this article, my friends also asked me the same question. It's like, because Minban education has been really talked a lot about, in the literature. So how would you differentiate it from Minjian? And I would say, so I will talk about what Minban is first. So Minban, so Min means people. Ban means managed, was operated. So basically the literary meaning of Minban education is a kind of education that is managed by the people. But I think the English literature mostly just understands it as private education. But this, of course, this makes sense. So my understanding of the difference between Minban and Minjian is that Minban is a specific kind of education, right? It's education, but Minjian is a space. So I define Minjian as a dynamic, social, cultural, political space beyond officialdom, where individuals engage in diverse forms of education. So this is my definition of Minjian. So space is the keyword for Minjian, but Minban is more about a specific kind of education. In other words, Minban education exists within the space of Minjian. And more specifically, Minban education exists within legitimate Minjian. Because when we talk about Minban education, in most cases, we talk about formal schooling, including like private schools and private universities. So this is what we mean by Minban education in most cases. Both Minban schools and Minban universities, they are aligned with the government's agenda. Otherwise, they can not exist at all, right? But I think Minban education exists largely within the space of legitimate Minjian. And I used the word largely because the boundary between the state and the legitimate Minjian are porous. So for example, some Minban schools, they are also kind of financially supported by the government. So you cannot really say these Minban schools are really in the legitimate Minjian only. But so just to use the water analogy again, there are some ripples from legitimate Minjian into the state. So that's why the boundary between the two is porous.
Right. So there's sort of the officialdom, and that would be the state and the funding it provides and the curriculum and what it demands of education, and Minban, which can be these sort of people-managed schools, but they are sometimes directly connected to an officialdom through financial channels or whatever it is.
Yes, definitely. So that's why the boundary between the state and legitimate Minjian is porous. And because we are talking about the boundaries, I want to mention that there is no clear boundary between legitimate and the shadowy Minjian, because Minjian itself is a vast pool of water, right? So water means that water just flows in whatever directions it wants, right? So there's no clear boundary. But the further away from the state, the more shadowy the Minjian gets. But there's no boundary there. Just everything is very just fluid, consistent. So you can understand Minjian as more like a continuum with two ends. One end is legitimate Minjian, the other one is shadowy Minjian.
And these different types of education activities and institutions that we're going to be talking about can't really be categorized into any one particular type of Minjian, but they can sort of, at different times occupied different versions of Minjian, as you're sort of talking about.
Yes, definitely. So Minjian, I think by nature, Minjian is flexible, it's adaptable. So that means maybe one kind of education at this moment, it can be categorized into, for example, legitimate Minjian. But next day or in a few years, as the policy changes, maybe that kind of education becomes, I don't know, maybe illegal. And then we have to move that towards shadowy Minjian. So everything is very dynamic, just like water.
Yeah. And a good example of that might be private supplementary tutoring, which has for a long time been very popular in China. And then the law changed and it was more or less outlawed. So maybe can you explain how private tutoring sort of fits into Minjian and how, as the policy changes, it moves into more shadowy Minjian?
Yeah, sure. So there was a very huge private tutoring industry in China because I grew up in China. So when I was a student, I really, took a lot of tutoring classes, after school and during weekends. So I know that very well. But in 2021, there was a policy called the double reduction policy, and it was implemented in China. And basically that policy cracked down on the private tutoring industry. So it's like all of a sudden tutoring for academic subjects like math, physics, Chinese, English. So such academic tutoring just all of a sudden became illegal. But as you can imagine, the Chinese parents, like many other East Asian parents, they're really insistent, right? They really want their kid to receive good education. And the Chinese parents compare themselves to other parents. So they are worried that if their kids do not receive, private tutoring as a supplement to schooling, their kids might be left behind by their peers, So the parents are just very worried. In other words, even though the double reduction policy was implemented and and basically, of course, it wiped out the entire academic tutoring industry, but the demand for private tutoring is still there, right? The demand does not disappear. As long as there is demand, there is supply. So what emerged is a large underground tutoring industry. So tutoring is illegal, right? People cannot provide that underground. So people just go under the ground and they provide tutoring, which is illegal. Because it is illegal, right? So it's not aligned with the government's agenda. It's against it. So I would position this kind of underground tutoring into shadowy Minjian.
Yeah, often private tutoring is called shadow education. This is like double shadow education or something like that.
Yes, it's a shadowy, yes, double, yeah, I like that.
Shadowy shadow education. What about this term you brought up earlier called innovation schools? And how do you see them, or innovative schools, how do you see them connected to this idea of Minjian?
Yes, so I will talk about what innovative schools are. So actually, I was very much interested in these schools. I planned to focus on these schools for my PhD thesis, but I just changed my plan a little bit. But anyway, so these innovative schools are schools that are set up by parents. So, there are a lot of middle-class parents who used to live in big cities like Beijing and Shanghai. Of course, because they lived in these cities, their kids were educated in these cities and in schools. But these parents just thought they did not want their kids to be educated that way because they thought the mainstream, education system in China is very high stake. It's very stressful and students just, study, and students do not have a lot of opportunities to, for example, to do sports or to go to museums, something like that. So these parents, they really want their kids to receive something called a holistic education. They want their kids to develop holistically. But the reality is that all schools in these big cities, they all follow the mainstream education model. So what these parents are doing is that they migrated from these big cities to relatively less developed areas. For example, the Yunnan province in southwestern part of China. So they migrated to these cities and they set up schools themselves. And these schools, of course, provide the kind of education they desire. So it's like, for example, their kids, in these schools, their kids can really, for example, go hiking on weekdays. They can really have a lot of interactions with nature to understand animals, plants, different things like that. So these are the innovative schools I was talking about in my article. A challenge to these schools is that because of the pedagogic kind of approaches of these schools, and for different reasons, most of these schools are not registered with the local government in Yunnan province. So because of that, because they are not registered, they are on a very kind of ambiguous legal basis, and they are quite fragile because maybe the government can shut down the schools one day. Who knows? So I would really position these innovative schools into shadowy Minjian because they are not really aligned with the state's education planning, education agenda, because they developed innovative pedagogies. In other words, these innovative schools are alternative to the mainstream schooling. So that's why I placed them into the shadowy space of Minjian.
It's such a nice concept because it gives you such a sort of foothold to try and understand these different manifestations of schooling and education that you sort of raised. And there's many others that we haven't talked about that you mentioned in your article, like museum visits or field trips or sort of unregistered migrant schools. And all of them, you can use this, conceptualization of Minjian to begin to make sense. And it's really valuable. But I think to start ending our conversation, I'd love to just sort of ask, do you think this concept that you're developing is useful outside of China?
Yeah, definitely. So in the conclusion of my article, I did talk a lot about the applicability of Minjian in different contexts. So basically, it's just about the contributions of the idea of Minjian, right? So a very direct contribution of Minjian obviously is to Chinese education research, right? Because it's conceptualization of legitimate and shadowy Minjian, as well as the dynamism and interflow between, the two Minjian spaces. So Minjian, for me, at least for Chinese education research, it is a new vocabulary and a conceptual map for researchers to navigate non-state kind of a space of education. But this roadmap also has implications across cultural contexts. So beyond China, I argue that Minjian exists in societies where the state plays a large role in shaping what can be seen and known, and where the state represents the mainstream, while values, visions, and activities outside these frameworks are sidelined as the non-mainstream, being less legitimate and increasingly shadowy. So I talked about, legitimate Minjian and the shadowy Minjian. So in general, I would argue across different contexts, legitimate Minjian is a space for non-state education that in different ways sort of partner with the official dome, or say partner with the government. So, such education could take place in private schools in different countries, different societies, in private schools, in universities, as well as in forums, like private tutoring, in different contexts. But this is legitimate Minjian in different contexts. But for shadowy Minjian in different contexts, so I argue that shadowy Minjian is a space for the pursuit of alternatives in forms of, for example, resistance, advocacy, and activism that fall outside the state's narrative. And I think what is really pertinent here is the large literature of critical education, in different contexts. So in my article, I also cited examples from different contexts to see, for example, so I cited examples from Mexico, from Brazil, and from South Africa. So there are schools there that are deeply engaged in this kind of advocacy kind of work. So I would say, so if we use the Minjian framework to talk about these schools, I would say these schools are in shadowy Minjian in different contexts. Because Minjian has, different, these kinds of connotations, it has implications for diverse fields under comparative education. So for example, the informal spaces of education in both legitimate and shadowy Minjian have implications for education in emergencies, because non-state actors, supported by the state or not, could offer education options that are potentially provisional and fragile. And I also argued, these informal spaces could also contribute to lifelong learning, as informal education is one of its pillars in showing legitimate and shadowy possibilities for learning across the lifespan. So this is what I wrote in the article about my understanding of how Minjian can be applied in different cultural contexts beyond China.
Well, Baiwen Peng, thank you so much for joining FreshEd. Congratulations on your article. I do think you are highlighting a concept that definitely can be used far and wide in the field of comparative education. So thank you for articulating it so clearly today.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's my great pleasure.
Baiwen Peng is a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota. His latest article was published in Comparative Education. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Ngunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements, and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORAG, the Shakdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next week.